Every time From Software releases a new video game, journalists, critics, and players end up discussing the complicated questions. How difficult is too difficult, and would From Software games benefit from having an easy mode? I wanted to consider where these questions come from, how the accompanying viewpoints are presented and defended, and where I want the discussion to go, all while minimizing direct comparisons to other artistic mediums. Questions concerning difficulty have always existed, even before Demon's Souls graced us with its existence. The reason I originally felt compelled to write about difficulty was an article by Forbes contributor David Thier titled, "Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, Needs to Respect Its Players and Add an Easy Mode." This headline caught my attention, largely because of its inflammatory construction, but I was also interested in how it portrays difficulty as a fundamental issue that manifests as a lack of respect. As the writer later puts it, the fact that these games don't have any difficulty settings means that only a certain sort of player with time, inclination, reaction speed, and lack of physical issues will ever see the final boss fight anywhere but on Twitch. This is a problem. But is it a problem? This article marks the unwavering physical requirements of the game as an issue that would be addressed by having multiple difficulty settings that impact in-game properties related to these physical requirements. These adjustments would make it possible for people of varying ability to get to the same ending, a status the article privileges above not finishing the game. Let's delve a little deeper into what goes into establishing a player's understanding of a game's difficulty, as well as what goes into engaging in a dialogue concerning difficulty, which can be just as difficult as the game itself. Another way to frame physical requirements is to view them as mechanical requirements and understandings. Games are more than the sum of their plot, presentation, and mechanics, and I put mechanics last because in the hierarchy of game analysis it is, ironically, the most difficult to critique and therefore more difficult to fully appreciate. While people are likely to share the same narrative, visual, and audio aesthetic appeal through cultural custom, mechanical ability is hard to transfer, is always transferred indirectly, and is easily distinguishable from one player to another. To further explain, no one can make you play the game better here meaning a playstyle that takes advantage of a game's mechanics to overcome its challenges in an efficient and/or stylish fashion. If anyone were to try to help you in this endeavor, they could only do so through external guides or visual aids. Likewise, no two players have the exact same understanding of a set of mechanics. That is not to say that one's understanding of language, visuals, and sounds are not also tailored by an individual's experiences, nor to suggest that aesthetic appeal isn't passed down. Rather, this distinction frames video games as an artistic medium that places a higher value on mechanical ability because that is the avenue on which video games fundamentally interact with the player. While some video game elitists would like to believe that video games are the only artistic works with interaction, I choose to view the unique interpretive elements of other artistic mediums, as well as the crowdsourced nature of some performance arts, as an interactive process in their own right. One is not necessarily more interactive than another, but the mode of interaction at play is different. However, that is a topic that is suited for a video of its own. So how are difficulty and mechanical requirements, made up of ability and knowledge, connected? While there is no linear graph to accurately illustrate how these two abstract notions work together, the relationship can be broken down as such. The higher the ability or knowledge required makes the game more difficult. This is only a general explanation of how game understanding and execution factor into a conception of difficulty. To continue, the requirements for competency are not the same as those for expert level play, yet both serve as standards of play in their own right. Ability refers to physical abilities like quick reaction times, accuracy, and even having time to play at all, while knowledge can be a player's understanding of embedded game mechanics such as how much damage the player does at a given time it takes to attack, the amount of damage enemies do, remembering how certain visual and audio elements distinguish different enemies, and so on and so forth. My examples do not encompass the entirety of ways difficulty exists, but it is a selection of the most common ways you may come to understand gameplay and its accompanying challenges. Both the ability and knowledge of mechanics can be worked on and overcome by the player, so one potential answer to the question, do From Software games need an easy mode, is to say to the player to create their own level of difficulty, get good, as the community often mocks whenever a new player believes a challenge to be insurmountable. However, this answer doesn't concern itself with the deeper criticisms over how much information is rendered pertinent in a game's design, which is perhaps a more interesting conversation than suggesting players simply study and rise to or create their own challenge. In some ways, the game itself decides what knowledge is important. Stamina has been an important trait of the Souls series, as it forces players to consider their consumption of a fundamental resource. To imagine these games without a stamina bar and its limitations on actions would be to imagine a game which required less mechanical knowledge than the version we currently know. In other words, Dark Souls would be easier. However, stamina doesn't exist in Sekiro, thus there is no need or ability to worry about stamina consumption. Knowledge of stamina and its impact on gameplay is important in Dark Souls, but not Sekiro. This removal would make the game easier if it weren't for the introduction of posture and a more robust countering system. I don't want to get too into the impact of Sekiro's differences, because I personally believe the result is a game which is superficially Souls-like yet mechanically quite distinct. But the point remains, there are mechanical aspects within the player's control and other aspects established by the game. The amount of necessary aspects established by the game will influence the point of entry of mechanical understanding. For some, this point of entry will be beyond a player's own understanding of their skills and may turn them away from the experience as a result. The fundamental question of the article and overall discussion of video game difficulty is how much of those mechanical aspects should be determined in the game, out of the control of the player. I've mentioned a player's understanding and experiences earlier, but I want to address how this manifests as player bias. What players are exposed to and capable of will greatly impact what they believe is important in a video game. If a player has quick reaction times but doesn't much care for the story framing their play, then narrative games are going to bore them and their preferences are best served by playing games that are solely focused on their mechanical interaction. On the other hand, if a player is interested in how games can present certain narratives, then the mechanical knowledge and ability required may feel like a detriment to their experience with the narrative. I am not advocating for one form of play over another. Both have their value, but I believe a great game is one that is able to incorporate narrative and mechanics in a two-way relationship where a player feels compelled to engage with play because of the story while simultaneously having a narrative informed by the mechanics. While all games do not need to strive for this interplay, for many players, this is the element that makes From Software games what they are. The experience of the story is inextricably connected with playing it. However, Thier does not seem to see it this way. He says, "But the difficulty is only one part of what defines these games for me, and honestly, it's not the most important part. From Software has some of the best world building in the business and, I would argue, the best character design. Difficulty here is framed as separate from world building and character design. The challenge associated with fighting enemies is not connected with his sense of the world and the characters." He goes on to say, "Lots of developers have attempted to imitate From's style of aggressively spare storytelling that relies on opaque item descriptions and occasional short dialogue to build out worlds. Yet, are these two ways the only means or even the means most relied on by From Software to achieve their signature oppressively dark world and atmosphere? The difficulty associated with these worlds plays a role in how a player interprets their experience in them. If the enemies did not hit as hard, and if there weren't so many of them, there would certainly be a loss of tension and dread that a player feels in the world as they make their way through its often claustrophobic and dreary environments. If these worlds weren't as bleak as they were, then the games would not warrant being as difficult as they are. That's the core of my argument. Different experiences warrant different levels of difficulty. Though I'm not convinced Thier would disagree with this argument, the question remains, is Sekiro too difficult? I don't believe it is, but I want to establish why by looking at how Thier and his dissenters frame their point of view. While Thier says he's been arguing for easy modes for the past few From Software games, he acknowledges those games have built-in mechanisms to assist players who are struggling. The previous games have a social component to them. The messaging system lets players help or deceive other players. The summoning system allows players to receive help from other players that ultimately trivialize any threat the bosses pose for the player while risking invasion from other, less helpful players. And certain weapons and builds made traversal through the different parts of the game easier. There was a balance to the aid, but it definitely gave struggling players a better chance at overcoming the odds. Thus, the game lets players choose their own difficulty. The only requirements are an internet connection and a drive to seek things out either through summon signs or online forums to find out how to safely dispatch foes. However, Sekiro disposes of most forms of in-game assistance. Since the article's original publication, messages have been added, as obnoxious as they are. Via online guides and wiki strategies, the community has since figured out all the secrets and methods to easily progress through the game. So part of a game's difficulty can be minimized over time, provided players are willing to wait for the community to figure it out for them. Although this is not how I prefer to experience these games, I don't hold anything against those who enjoy the game more when the legwork of discovering enemy nuances is done by other players. Players are still unable to get assistance from others directly via co-op unless they go through the extra process of installing cooperative mods. From Software has expressed the benefits of not having multiplayer on the world and level design of this game, but whether this makes up for the inherent increase in difficulty by raising the minimum requirements of a player's mechanical ability is contestable. Sekiro is an outlier in this regard, and it seems that From Software has taken note about the value of co-op, considering its re-inclusion in Elden Ring. In this regard, optional co-op seems to be a good middle ground for addressing disparities in difficulty without compromising on the set challenge many seem to enjoy. I doubt anyone committed to the idea that From Software games should have a singular difficulty option also want to see the removal of cooperative play, considering the replay value the feature adds to the game. Let's look at Thier's interpretation of co-op's removal. Sekiro removes summoning, and so if you run up against a brick wall, that's it. Either beat your head against that wall or stop playing. I do not like the idea of coming up against a boss that I can't beat without a week of frustration, and so I can't let myself get obsessed with this one. For Thier, the only solution is to keep going up against the same enemy until either they or the player are defeated through a process of attrition, but that's not the only possibility. Sekiro opens up once you get to Ashina Castle, offering multiple paths that give the player a number of options in how they wish to go about playing. At its worst, the game lets you farm for experience and sen that increases the player's arsenal of abilities and consumables. At a point, this type of farming loses its efficiency, and this change encourages players to take on the challenges they once thought insurmountable. The game is not about beating your head against the wall until the enemy is defeated. Players are encouraged to reasonably increase their avatar skill to accompany and compensate for their player skill. This gives players some leeway with the process of learning enemy movements and attack patterns, which has become a staple of beating these games. This method of play has been contextualized by the hollowing and nightmare premise of the previous games and makes its way into Sekiro through the resurrection mechanic, which has a more immediate effect on the story and how the player interacts with non-player characters. Death and failure are contextualized very well in these games. Failure is not a static state as much as it is a temporary setback, which is a good way to approach failure outside of video games as well. Without the threat of death, the tension of traversing the world is diminished and it becomes less threatening as a result, though players seem to enjoy engaging in this terrifying environment. At least that's the case for a majority of those who enjoy the last decade of From Software games. Would an easy mode break this delicate balance of difficulty? Thier suggests it would not. It's worth saying, time and time again, an easy mode does not have to change the core experience in any way at all. Period. Playing a version of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice that has an easy mode would, theoretically, be completely identical to playing Sekiro Shadows Die Twice now. The continued insistence that an easy mode would somehow affect the normal mode seems to represent a player's lack of respect for themselves, an idea that they would not be able to play the game that they want without ruining it for themselves. While the general idea of his argument makes sense, having an easy mode does not impact players who choose the normal mode because it literally does not impact how the game is experienced for those players. This does not address the concern players have over how these two experiences are different from one another. Thier says that all you need to do is turn up the damage the player does and turn down the damage the enemies do, but players and critics must consider how this influences the overall experience. Games that take this approach to different levels of difficulty tend to break combat encounters by either making them pointless on the very easy end, such that encountering an enemy becomes a nuisance and overall detrimental to the experience of the game, while on the other end of the difficulty spectrum, enemies become ridiculous health tanks that can kill the player in one attack, making combat a process of finding the safest, often tedious, way of fighting. This approach to the difficulty either trivializes or negatively emphasizes the effects of combat. Game difficulty can be tackled in other ways, as seen in hack and slash games where difficulty modes influence the number of enemies, enemy layouts, and enemy movesets. Trying to balance these different components requirements leads to more work on the developer, and the process of making games means that something else, like core mechanics that persist throughout all difficulty settings, will not get as much attention. In an ideal world, all games get enough time to fine-tune the core and be able to address how to best adjust different difficulty modes, but the unfortunate reality is that most games do not have the time or means to properly do this. For a great example of a wonderful game that struggled with difficulty settings, look no further than Halo 2. An overall great game, but playing this game on solo or even co-op legendary is a masochist's wet dream. There's nothing fairly balanced about the experience, and sometimes you'll have to be moving before the game has completed loading in if you hope to survive. It's very clear that not enough development time was given to work out all the kinks of the various difficulties, although given the history of Halo 2's development, that is hardly surprising. That said, here we see an instance where time constraints created a version of the experience not many people can enjoy. If you're one of those people who had no trouble working through Halo 2 on Legendary, I have nothing but respect for your skill, but I still believe the skill floor for it is above what it should be and makes the prospect of playing the game on Legendary absolutely dreadful. This isn't to say that Halo 2 would be a better game with one difficulty section, as that never seemed to be in the cards, but we can still acknowledge how much a difficulty can be detrimental to the overall package for some, if not most, players. This detriment can also exist for players of From Software games with only one difficulty option. However, we've already acknowledged how their games allow players to augment difficulty through means outside of a settings option or slider. To get back to the article, Thier believes that players lack respect for themselves because they may ruin the game by choosing an easier difficulty mode, though this belief is undercut by his admission that previous From Software games allowed for just that. It has always been possible to make the game easier through summoning and using certain abilities, and players who wanted a greater challenge either refused to use them or imposed harder challenges by excluding the use of certain fundamental game mechanics like leveling. Sekiro limits or entirely removes some of the mechanics that made previous From Software games easier, but it replaces them with limited consumables that were previously absent and also stacks the odds in the player's favor. Whether a player feels comfortable using these consumables varies, but the options are there for those who wish to take them. There is even an option to increase enemy damage, though with a much higher item drop rate for players who want to engage with that risk. Simply because an easy mode is unavailable does not mean there are not tools to make the game easier. Without diving too deep into it, Sekiro's combat focus is less on health and more about breaking enemy posture, so Thier's suggestion to make the game easier by raising player damage would not change how hard boss combat encounters play out, with the focus of most bosses being on breaking enemy posture over dealing direct damage. If the suggestion is to increase posture damage, not only are there already ways to do that in-game via upgrades and consumables, many basic enemies lose their posture after 3 hits, and early enemies become comically easy to kill 5 or so hours into the game. There is a difference between having these options there from the start and having the player come to unlock them as they progress through the game. Asking for the game to change such fundamental elements of the mechanics is not examining the game for what it is, rather such a mindset examines it for what it isn't, or based on an experience the game does not aim to give. Reviewers who do not enjoy games of this difficulty are not useless, despite what people on the internet might say about their skill. These reviewers make the correct assessment that the difficulty curve makes it hard for many players to complete the game. The issue is that they often go on to suggest that this is a bad thing, which isn't necessarily true. Likewise, there are players who enjoy this kind of challenge and believe it makes them a superior player because they value this kind of experience, but really it's just a testament to the different kinds of experiences video games offer. The discussion ultimately comes down to whether individual video games should embed different modes of play from the start. There are options to make games easier outside of the permitted settings through hacking and modding, so there are means for players to experience the full game despite it not being condoned or encouraged within the game. Even then, some games do have options to enable God mode, many of which do not draw the ire of an internet crowd. It is an entitled point of view to suggest anyone and everyone is owed an artistic experience, let alone an artistic experience tailored for them. Some video games will be made with accessibility at the forefront of their development, others will not. Both approaches offer different experiences, and to privilege one over the other says more about the player than it does the art. I do not mean to be dismissive of or apathetic to players with physical disabilities that make it harder to play difficult games. I do not believe there is any shame in needing to use third-party software to enjoy a single-player game. While there is a community for these single-player games that prize themselves on everyone having the same base game to experience, the community is not diminished or harmed by players using what they need to enjoy it. It is fair to want these third third-party tools included in the game and easily accessible to break any stigma that is associated with using them. The inclusion or exclusion of an easy mode provides both an artistic and political message, and it is possible to appreciate the artistic while criticizing the political. I believe any stance on the difficulty issue will reveal which of the two any given player prioritizes, but explicit moralizing of the discussion will not lead to the most fruitful dialogue. The art and politics of difficulty are not inherently diametrically opposed, as there are games that avoid the conversation altogether. However, in the case of From Software games, there is a valid argument to be made that the mechanics of difficulty impact the artistic experience to such a degree that having direct control over the abstractions of combat as given in a difficulty selection would provide a different experience that the rest of the game doesn't reinforce. To say a change in difficulty would not reinforce the rest of the experience implies an inferior experience for those who greatly value the mechanical importance of establishing theme and atmosphere. Those who find combat tedious yet find the world engaging nonetheless are asking for an all-around different experience than the one being offered in preferring an easier difficulty. For those who prefer artistic expression to mainly exist through player choice, there is a value in this form of criticism, but people looking for a more directed approach to gameplay will find this perspective lacking. And yet, any direction fundamentally limits the scope of mechanics and player engagement, which focuses the artistic expression. The way I see it, it's just a matter of picking your poison and playing the video games that satisfy what you're looking for while letting others do the same. So do From Software games need an easy mode? Maybe.